Hello, everybody. My name is Rachel Paling, and absolutely delighted to be with gallery teachers today with this masterclass. And the masterclass is really going to focus on using coaching and neuroscience to enhance language learning. I'm often asked, what is the reason to bring coaching and neuroscience into the language learning process? So I'm hoping that this presentation today will give some of those answers. And if you are interested in any more information, do check in with all of my links, and definitely after the masterclass, I'm happy to share or answer any further questions that you may have. Now, the real question is, what is coaching? And I know there are many, many, many different takes or perspectives of coaching. And perhaps if we take a walk through history, we can see that originally the word comes from the Hungarian, and it means a form of transport. It means getting somebody from A to B. Then mid-19th century, it was hijacked by the sports world, and we have the sports coach. And I think this is possibly the first thing that we all think about when we think about a coach. That person who is pushing us, empowering us to go beyond our limits, to achieve records and goals and win matches. That essence of the sports coach, the feeling of somebody who is empowering, non-judgmental, really accompanying somebody, is the spirit that we then see coming into life coaching. In the 1970s, we saw the development of life coaching over in the US, then over in the UK, and now I think we have coaching everywhere. It seems to be a default in many, many disciplines. Now, the interesting thing is that the original or the International Coach Federation perspective of coaching is not about telling people what to do. It's not about giving advice. It's not about teaching. It's not about being the expert showing. It's more about being the facilitator, the soundboard, the person who is mirroring back to the coachee to allow the coachee to find their own strength, to find their own power, to find their own path, their own goals, and their own actions. That's the essence of life coaching. Now, obviously, at some point, if there is that need to exchange expertise, we do it from the perspective of, may I share with you? Can I just see if this might resonate with you? So it is very, very different to the sports coach. Now, life coaching developed into executive coaching. Nowadays, you have all different types of coaching. You have team coaching, intuitive coaching, marriage coaching, career coaching. And of course, nowadays, we have language coaching. And again, with many, many different perspectives. To be a professional coach, there is a lot of training involved in the background. Because as a professional coach, we really have to understand how to manage coaching conversations. Can anybody call themselves a coach? Well, actually, yes, they can. Coaching is not a regulated profession. It really is something that is standardized by certain institutions or professional bodies over the world. These are the major coaching institutions worldwide. And the most recognized is definitely the International Coach Federation. ICF was created in the 1990s, and it is a non-profit organization which really sets out the standards, the guidelines, and the ethics for the coaching profession. And as I said, as a worldwide recognized body, the ICF has their own programs to give coaching credentials, the ACC, the PCC, the MCC. And also the ICF accredits programs worldwide. The program that I run, the Neurolanguage coaching training, is in fact accredited by the International Coach Federation. Now, this means that we go into the general principles from coaching and we transport these into the language learning process. So everything that you can find in a normal coaching engagement is now transcending and coming into neurolanguage coaching. So we have a coaching agreement. We have confidentiality that we voice. We have a special goal setting process. We have special action setting process. We talk about motivation and commitment. We are there to manage the progress and the accountability. Plus, we have the philosophy of working on goals over short time periods, which then, after the time period, we're sitting down and we're reviewing with the coachee. So how can coaching enhance learning? Well, there are various aspects that we can use from coaching to really empower language learning. One of the major things that coaching does, it brings the coach into great observation and self-awareness, awareness of how we communicate with our learners. The way that we communicate is key because we have to understand that the power of words really does impact on the learner. How we ask those questions has a great impact. How we are demonstrating active listening, how we are creating compassionate conversations with coaching models, how we give feedback, and even the way that we are in those sessions is going to be impacting and influencing the learner. Now, just hopping into the neuroscience a minute, the words that we choose when we are communicating really do have a physiological impact. So a single word can actually influence the genes that are regulating physical and emotional stress. And positive words can even be stimulating this prefrontal cortex and also then stimulating all other areas of the brain. So how can we choose the way that we communicate in a very wise way? Because in fact, as well, the way that we communicate as teachers could be triggering emotional responses. You know, I very often ask, how many people like to be told what to do? How many people like to be given orders? And as teachers, we are very directive at times. We're constantly, without realizing it, giving orders. That could, in fact, be creating emotional triggers. If somebody doesn't like to be told what to do, they don't like to receive orders, that could be then having that spiral effect of emotional shutdown in the brain. So the way that we communicate is very, very important. Secondly, how we conduct those conversations is also key. And we can have very powerful coaching conversations using the coach competencies. The ICF, the International Coach Federation, there are in fact 8 coach competencies at the moment. They changed them from 12 to 8 this year, 2021. And in particular, when you train as a professional coach, you are learning how to embody a coach mindset. Now, I always say this is about living, breathing, and being the coach. It's not enough to say that you're a coach. You have to live that figure of being a coach, embodying the mindset. We have to be establishing the trust, the intimacy, the psychological safety in our sessions. We have to be actively listening, and that means very deep listening. And by the way, as a language coach, you're not only listening for the language, you're also listening for the paralinguistics, the emotional triggers. Maybe there's a sign that is not linguistically voiced, but we're sensing something. So active listening goes beyond just saying, I'm listening to you. Again, coming back to those questions, many, many years ago, I recognized that I was constantly asking closed questions. Do you, could you, would you? And in fact, when we change the way that we ask questions, it has a very strong effect on our learners. So opening those questions out, stimulating their minds to respond. The way that we signpost is also key, the way that we reformulate, give feedback. And I always think that coaching is about, well, it's a little bit of a dichotomy, because on the one side, we need to be bringing a structure and framework to our process, but on the other side, we need to be present in the moment and have that spontaneity to sit with that learner and respond to whatever is happening in those instances. When we talk about coaching, we always think that the coach has to be empathetic. And personally, I think that teachers are already empathetic. So it's not about empathy as a teacher or empathy as a coach. However, I do think it's about going beyond empathy. From the neuroscience, we know that empathy is lighting up the areas of the brain connected with pain and reward. Compassion is actually triggering what we would call the love circuits in the body and the mind. So we have a different area of the brain lighting up. It's actually the periaqueductal gray that is lighting up when we go into feeling compassion. So how do we manifest this difference when we're communicating? Well, empathy is, I feel what you feel. But compassion is, I feel what you feel, and how can I help? Pushing somebody into action. So compassion, and I do think coaching, when you come into that compassionate approach, it is constantly about trying to find solutions, trying to find the way forward. Coaching is a forward-looking process. That's the difference with empathy and compassion. Powerful coaching as well means that we're probably going to be using coaching models. We're going to be very aware that when we need to, we might be coaching around blocks, triggers. We might be troubleshooting maybe difficulties in the learning process, maybe difficulties of understanding, and we're going to be trying to bring in coaching conversations around those, and also conversations about learning how to learn, metacognition, and stimulating. And instead of telling people, you should do this, you should do that, we need to be asking people what they feel they need and should be doing. That's coaching. So we've looked at the coaching side, and now let's come a little bit into the neuroscience. And everything that we bring into the neurolanguage coaching process is based on neuroscientific research, psychological research. And what we're doing, we're bringing those principles into the learning process. So why neuroscience? Well, it's interesting that, for many, many years, we thought we knew what was happening psychologically in the brain. But until the 1970s, 1980s, until we had the actual technology with the MRI scans, the computer imaging, we didn't really have confirmations of certain processes or certain what is happening when we're learning. Now, we really do have a lot of information about how we learn, how we function, how we react. However, even though we have basic functions which are the same, no two brains are the same. And in fact, some of the neuroscientists talk about the fact that we have a part of the brain which is our genetic input, and the rest is what we ourselves are inputting throughout our lives. And this always makes me think that whatever the genetic input that you may have, it's actually going to be totally different to mine. Plus, what I have lived, what I have learned, what I have input is going to be totally different to anybody else in the world. And this means that we all have different perspectives of life. We all interpret things in a different way. And I think that's one of the major key messages as an educator, to respect every single learner that I have in front of me when I'm in that learning process. Now, interestingly, when people hear the word neuroscience, they always think of the brain. I actually like to take that thought into neurons. The neuro in neuroscience is referring to neurons, and neurons are nerve cells. We have nerve cells all over the body. And in fact, there is an area that the neuroscientists call the second brain, which is the gut. This particular area of our bodies has millions of neurons. The heart also has neurons. Obviously, the nervous system has neurons. So it's not only about the brain. I always think that neuroscience is about the holistic human. And definitely as educators, we have to also bear in mind that we're talking about the holistic human. We're not just talking about the brain. Now, why use neuroscience? And interestingly, many years ago, when I started to deliver my program and training, one German coachee who came to my course, actually working in a university, he asked me the question, Rachel, why do you go into the neuroscience? Why do you go into talking about the brain? And my answer to him was, isn't it time that we did? When we think about learning and all these years, we've never, ever, if I had known more about the brain and how I could learn as a child, I actually think my whole learning process in those early years would have been totally different if I had had these insights. And in fact, one of the early research investigations involving Carol Dweck, the lady that wrote about growth mindset, this particular research demonstrates that when we give children that information that the brain is plastic, the brain is malleable, we can, let's say, create intelligence, we can learn. These children that were given this message actually were achieving higher grades in 2 years of junior high school than the children that were not given that message, the children that thought that intelligence is fixed. So we can see that it really does have an impact on people when they start to understand their capacity. It's almost like we feel empowered to know that we can achieve things. Now, the other question with neuroscience is that if we can bring metacognition, and when we talk about metacognition, we're talking about learners understanding how to learn. We're talking about how to improve cognitive skills. And we're also talking about awareness of self, observation of self. So there are 3 different aspects to metacognition. Now, as I said, when we think about metacognition, from this research, we know that it does have an impact. And in fact, in this research, we saw that metacognition in schools was benefiting from primary to university students and even learners with learning difficulties. And it was leading to better performance, improved outcomes, and actually more motivation. So metacognition is really key in learning. And the more that we as a coach can be facilitating, mirroring, soundboarding with our learner what this means, the more impact they're going to get in that learning process. And the importance of psychological safety, I mean, knowing that they are in an emotionally safe space can totally change and transform how they are learning a language. This particular research, actually, there's 2 research papers here that demonstrate anxiety with mathematics. I think that language learning is absolutely on the same level as math anxiety. And maybe we could even say that for some people, language anxiety is even more. We see here from the research that math anxiety actually reduces working memory capacity, it reduces attention, and it reduces the functions of prefrontal cortex, the executive functions in the brain. And even the thought of doing mathematics triggered the pain areas in the brain. As I said, I personally think that language learning has the same effect. So we have to understand how we can bring the calm, how we can help people go through those emotional triggers to get them into what I call a learning state and feeling psychologically safe. So let's have a look at the learning process. And I think when we really bring information about how we learn and about language learning to our learners, that's when they start to have a lot of insights. Now, I've just chosen a few of the aspects that, as educators, we can be bringing to the learner to have more or deeper understanding. We need to help them to understand explicit and implicit learning, flow states, the neuromyth of learning styles, the science of learning, impact of positive emotions, provoking brain connections, getting the right level of attention, and spaced learning. And I'm going to go a little bit into each of these. Now, if we think about explicit and implicit learning, as children, we learn our native language very implicitly. Implicit learning means subconscious learning. And children under the age of 7, each and every one of us, in those early years, we learned our native language. It probably took us about 4 or 5 years to really speak our native language well, because we were learning implicitly using that procedural memory and just absorbing the language, almost like we are just picking it up in those early years. Now, as adults, we tend to focus on explicit learning. Explicit learning is where we are battling away with grammar, with theory, with data, with information, and piecing it together, a lot of prefrontal cortex activity. As adults, we tend to use more this declarative memory to actively learn these grammar, rules, vocabulary of the new language. Now, the interesting thing is, I always say that as an adult, yes, we need to come into that explicit learning, but we also need to think about the implicit learning and the implicit input. I always think of Stephen Krashen when I talk about this, because in some ways, what we're talking about here is language learning and language acquisition. Could we say that language learning is the explicit and language acquisition is the implicit? So knowing the difference here is going to help us help our learners to really think, well, what can I do that's going to reflect that explicit learning? And what can I do that's going to reflect the implicit learning? Interestingly, in this research from 2006, we see that a lot of learning is actually happening at the subconscious level. And I'm always fascinated how we can increase that. That leads me into the question of the flow. And quite recently, very sadly, we've lost our maestro, from the flow. The originator of the flow state, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. And flow is quite a fascinating brain state. They say that we are so, I'm going to say, receptive to learning. It's almost like we go into that genius state when we go into the flow. How can we get our learners into the flow when they're learning languages? This is a great question for each and every one of us. When we get so involved, when we start to have that transient hyperfrontality, we call it, where this prefrontal cortex is shutting down and we're just flowing with the language, we're just letting go. And I always wonder how we can get our learners into that flow state. Definitely something for us to think about. Interestingly, Montessori children are more likely and more frequently in flow states. That's research from 2005. And I find that absolutely fascinating, that obviously Montessori children are getting into activities that they totally get absorbed in. And that also is allowing them to come into that learning, optimized learning state. Now, moving into another area that we have to go deeper into, it's really this question about neuromyths of the learning styles. Now, I know there's a lot of people talking about this at the moment. And if we look at the trajectory of this research, we see that in 2012, we had Decker, Lee, and Howard Jones and Joels actually saying that when we have material in our dominant sensory style, that's when we learn best. However, then we had research in 2013 saying, well, actually, we could identify 71 different styles. And then from 2015, 2016 onwards, we see this new body of science called the science of learning, with Tokuhama Espinosa leading the way. And here we see the research saying that more multiple input from different sensory channels is going to produce optimized learning, improved learning. Now, I actually totally agree with that. However, I also agree with the fact that we need to be asking our learners, do they have a predominant way that works for them? When I ask many people about this, they actually say, yes, they do. They have a way that they know works and a way that really helps them to make it stick. Personally, I know that if I write something down, that is my way of learning quickly. And I think as an educator, we're always trying to find what works for people, what doesn't work for people. And I think it's very, very, very important to check with our learner what they don't like to do when they're learning, so that we're not provoking states where they're not feeling comfortable, they're not feeling happy, and actually we could get those emotional triggers starting and kicking in. So learning styles is something that we have to explore with learners. Each of these points are something that we have to go deeper into. So as I said, we have to go into deeper the explicit, the implicit, understanding what is the flow state, understanding what is this question of multiple sensory input or learning styles or not learning styles. Plus, we have to understand the impact of positive emotions. Definitely, we're looking to increase the production of dopamine in a learning situation. The more dopamine in the prefrontal cortex when people are learning, the more connections per second. Now, how do we increase dopamine? Well, various ways: variety, curiosity, keeping the sessions fun, lively, creating rewards, getting people to feel in control but a little bit challenged, and actually real-time positive feedback. All of these are going to be ways that we can really increase that positive chemical, which leads to the positive emotions. And knowing that the brain is a connection machine, we as a coach, understanding how the brain works, really means that we're constantly trying to provoke those associations and connections. And this particular research is research that I absolutely adore, because in 2016, we see for the first time that when we are learning a new language, the brain is going to the native areas of language first. The brain is trying to scaffold, the brain is trying to build from previous knowledge. And the brain really does care if there are similarities. So it's trying to reuse the mother tongue to learn the new language. Now, from my own experience, I've done that through life with my language learning. So from school, I learned French, Greek, Latin. And with the French and the Latin, at the age of 15, I then taught myself Spanish. Coming into teach yourself Spanish books, plus that input from the French and the Latin, it was my springboard into Spanish. That was then my springboard into Catalan. That was then my springboard into Italian. And then at the age of about 28, 29, I remember thinking, what's the reason that I can't learn German? And later, in those years when I was living in Germany, I started to connect into the Germanic side of English. And that opened the doors for me, because then I was able to springboard from my Germanic side of English into German. And now, in my Russian learning at the moment, I'm really trying to see where I can make those connections. As a coach, that's what we need to be doing. We need to be stimulating constantly to provoke these connections between the languages. Now, that doesn't mean that we're constantly speaking in the native language. Not at all. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we become the provocateur par excellence. Now, another thing that we have to really understand is how to get the attention of our learners. We need to get the right level of attention. And back in the 1950s, we already had this attention curve where if we find the right level, we get performance at its peak. And that's called the eustress level of attention. And finally, we have to understand the impact of spaced learning. Drip by drip, step by step, that really is going to have an impact. When we have intensive courses, when we go into an intensive learning environment, we really are boosting the short-term memory. However, we would need to then be understanding how we can follow up that particular input with more input to get that learning into long term. So short terms feel good at the beginning, but if we don't follow up afterwards, we're going to lose that information very quickly. However, if we're learning step by step, drip by drip, that is a better rate of I'm going to say it's more enhanced learning. And together with that research, we also see that testing helps. And it helps because of this step by step, drip by drip, reminding the brain of that particular information. The problem with the word test is it makes many people nervous. And I strongly recommend, and here we come back to the power of words, I strongly recommend changing the word test for consolidation or review. So you could say to your learners, how about next week we start our session with some consolidation? And the test itself is actually renamed consolidation. Now, as educators, bearing in mind all of this information, we start to get our learners into more optimized learning states. That's what we're looking for as educators. And this is the reason that we really are using the neuroscience, and we're using coaching as that vehicle of communication to bring across the learning, the language learning. When we go to neurolanguage coaching and we're bringing it all together, it's imperative for us to understand the impact of emotion and social pain, the differences between explicit and implicit learning, the impact of having psychological safety in that learning process, how to encourage what I call that perfect learning state. We have to know how to coach them around the triggers. If we suddenly have a moment where our learner has gone into that triggered state, how do we bring them out of that? How do we get them around those bad learning memories? How do we constantly provoke those brain connections? And how do we all the time maintain that brain-friendly, very calm communication? And especially when we are bringing grammar information to the learner. So all of these factors are imperative to understand as a neurolanguage coach. And coaching in neuroscience, and just to wrap up at this point, it is about communicating through coaching conversations. It is about, at the same time, manifesting in everything that we do those coach competencies and the ethics from the coaching engagement. It is about using the structure of the coaching process. So that means understanding motivation, understanding commitment, setting clear goals and actions, plus the periodic goal reviews. Having a clear understanding of how the brain works, learns, and reacts, and sharing that with our learners when we need to, but not in theoretical medical jargon, but actually in very simple terms. If we're with a child, if we're with a teenager, if we're with an adult, being able to share that information so that our learner understands themselves as well. And practically implementing the neuroscience, everything that we do in neurolanguage coaching has a reason. Every single thing in our process is following some neuroscientific principle from the research. Helping our clients to develop self-awareness, and we use unique models. We go into our own unique goal settings, from mechanical goals for mastery goals. We go into a clear structure of an engagement. We go into what I call the progress spiral learning process. And we use a very special coaching model, PACT PQC, to take our learners through grammar. It's about having what we would say a brain-friendly process, and constantly giving the certainty with a framework, with a roadmap, a personalized roadmap, remembering that every single learner or group of learners is different. So there's going to be a personalized roadmap for each one, breaking it down all the way. So if we look at neurolanguage coaching, it really is about encompassing the coaching and the neuroscience to make a transformed learning process. Well, neurolanguage coaching impacts language learning in, I would say, various ways. Definitely, it is incorporating professional coaching into the language learning process. So if we look at that and we unpack that a little bit, that means that we're bringing in the structure from professional coaching, which is the goal setting, the action setting, the motivation, the commitment, the ethics, the guidelines, the standards, the goal reviews. Plus, we're bringing in from the coaching the way that we communicate. So incorporating the coaching competencies, active listening, powerful questions, coaching presence, spontaneity, it's that dancing in the moment, and it's having that flexibility, that spontaneity, together with that personalized framework and roadmap for the learner. That's what we're bringing in from coaching, plus powerful coaching conversations. If we need to, we're going to be using coaching models to troubleshoot maybe problems with the learning process, to troubleshoot emotional triggers, blocks, anything that we need to then help our learner to get back on track with the language learning. That's from the coaching side. Now, from the neuroscience, what we are bringing in is the research. We're implementing the scientific principles from the research. And we're firstly implementing these principles into the process. So everything that we do in neurolanguage coaching has a reason behind it. For example, breaking it down. For example, bringing out positive feedback. For example, bringing brain connections with target and native language, because the research is demonstrating the effects of all of these principles. We're incorporating them into the learning process. That's the first way that neuroscience is brought in. The second way is by sharing with our learners what I call the golden nuggets of how we learn, how the brain functions, how the brain reacts. And by giving that information to learners, it helps them to understand themselves more. It brings in the effect of metacognition. And metacognition from the research we see has a three-way effect. It can increase cognitive skills, it can increase self-awareness and observation of self, and also it increases the capacity to understand for oneself how to learn, learning how to learn. That's the three-way impact of metacognition. So these are the reasons that we really are bringing in neuroscience and coaching, and that's how Neurolanguage Coach is impacting the language learning. We need to talk about the brain because, as I've just mentioned, the impact of metacognition is phenomenal on learners. And I think as well, the information that we now know that the brain is plastic, we know that we can learn throughout life. I think that really can change the perspective for each and every one of us of how we live our lives. You know, at my age, I'm still learning. I'm still going for new masters. I want to do a PhD. I want to learn new things. My curiosity is never, ever going to stop. And if we can bring this information to learners, it can totally change their perspective of life. So not only of the language learning process, but also about themselves. And the journey into the brain for each and every one of us, I think it's one of the most mysterious and intriguing journeys that we can all have, to really get to know ourselves, to really know exactly what we want, and to know who we are and our capacity and how we can go beyond ourselves. That's going to also be another impact that we are bringing when we're talking about the brain.